Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the HBES Virtual Roundtable series. Sorry for the delay. I'm Courtney Crosby, a graduate student at the University of Texas, one of the organizers of this series, along with Christopher Smith from the University of Pennsylvania and Paul Deutschman from Boston College. Before we start, we'd again like to thank Corinne Apicella at the University of Pennsylvania, Chris Von Ruden at the University of Richmond, and Carrie Pick at Arizona State University for proposing this series, the Executive Council of HBES for their support, Nicole Barbaro and Bernard Fink for their help marketing this series. Because this is an HBES-sponsored event, please note that this meeting is subject to the HBES Code of Conduct, which has been shared in the chat. And we just ask that you be polite and professional. And if you violate that, then we may remove you from this session, but hopefully we don't have to do that. And we also encourage audience participation throughout the event. So if you have a question, please use the Ask Question button at the bottom right of your screen. And also feel free to what you find interesting so that those go to the top for our moderator and speakers to answer. And today we will focus on life history theory as applied to inter-individual variation, which accompanies a special issue in Evolution and Human Behavior titled Current Debates in Human Life History Research. And moderating our event today is Dr. Willem Frankenhuis. Willem is an associate professor of psychology at Utrecht University and a senior researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Research on Crime, Security, and Law. And take it away.
All right. Welcome, everybody. What a pleasure to be here. And I just saw that there's over 200 people attending right now. So from all across the world, people's minds are, allocating time and effort onto, life history theory and its applications to human behavior and cognition and physiology. So thanks, everybody, for joining. And of course, thank you, panelists, for sharing your thoughts today and exchanging ideas. So the topic is, current debates in human life history research, and we'll focus on individual differences. And this topic is also the theme of a special issue, which Courtney just described, that Daniel, Nettle, and I co-edited for Evolution and Human Behavior. That special issue should be live very soon, later this month. So keep an eye on the journal's website. I would also like to say that this is the second roundtable, and the first roundtable was also tethered to a special issue, and that was on cross-cultural research, human diversity, and there was also a wonderful discussion there a few weeks ago. So I also would encourage people who were not able to attend that meeting or who haven't seen it since to check it out on YouTube, I believe. So Daniel, Nettle, and I, we've been doing research on sort of evolution and development in harsh and unpredictable environments for a while together, and we've always been very excited about applications of life history theory to basically the human species. And at the same time, we saw that there was sort of a proliferation of different ideas and different methods occurring in the field, and we were having these discussions trying to kind of make sense of it all. How is it all connected, and how is it all connected to sort of the the anchor of evolutionary biology, where this field started. And so trying to understand the different perspectives on this topic was really a motivation for us to edit this special issue together, and to get different viewpoints at the table. So really, by design, we try to invite people who we know have use different ideas and use different methods, and to sort of take stock of what is the field currently doing, which directions do we think are particularly promising, which directions ought to be developed but have not been developed yet. And so that's really what we're what really has been the the kernel from the beginning. And so this roundtable, where we are all sitting at a digital table together, just fits perfectly in that broader, deeper narrative. So, of course, we also have 4 different panelists who have related and somewhat different ideas on particular topics, and it will be very interesting to flesh that out. And in addition, there's over 200 minds who are attending through, through online. And so I would also really encourage people to raise questions. Courtney also mentioned this, and I will at some point start seeing those questions, and then I can kind of weave them into the discussion, as they fit. So today I am joined by these 4 wonderful panelists, 4 scientists working on human life history. One of them is Keelah Williams. She's an assistant professor of psychology at Hamilton College. By Rebecca Sear, a professor working on demography, anthropology, and behavioral ecology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Marco Del Giudice, who is an associate professor of psychology at the University of New Mexico, and Daniel Nettle, who is a professor of behavioral science at Newcastle University. And so I'd like to just begin by acknowledging that it's been a difficult time for many of us during the pandemic, and I would, in any circumstance, appreciate your time, but in these challenging times, I appreciate it even more, and I'm sure the community does too. And so I have prepared, questions to kind of kickstart the conversation. Those I will start with in a moment. But before I do that, I thought it'd be nice if each of the panelists could briefly introduce themselves, just to sort of state their primary research interest to the audience. So maybe Rebecca, would you like to start?
Sure, thanks, Willem. I have been working on life history traits now in humans for frighteningly almost 20 years. So I come from the evolutionary anthropology tradition. I started work looking at life history trade-offs, mainly in lower income contexts. My interests have evolved over time to looking at early life experiences and how they affect the outcomes of life history traits. I'm becoming more and more interested in health inequalities. Overall, I'm particularly interested in using the very rigorous paradigm of life history theory and evolutionary biology to strengthen the social and the health sciences. So I'm very interested in interdisciplinary work.
Keelah?
Hi, everyone. I'm a bit of an oddity on this panel because I don't study life history in humans. I study the social perception of life history strategy. So with respect to some of the controversies that we'll be talking about today in terms of the panel, I think that makes me Switzerland, or perhaps by citation count, Liechtenstein. But I'm very excited to be here and to hear many of the insights from all of our other panelists and from the audience.
Marco?
Hi, everyone. I'm a psychologist, or at least I think I am. My research, most of it deals with individual differences. So that's kind of the overarching theme of my work. And I've been using ideas from a life history framework to try to frame some questions and develop some, ideas and hypotheses and interpret some data. And my perspective on individual differences takes a little developmental perspective on some issues. I've done some research that's more about neurobiological emphasis. And more recently, I've started working quite a bit on psychopathology. So the disorder, let's say, extreme of variation. And also, I've used some ideas about the fast-low continuum to frame those questions too. So yeah, that's my introduction.
I guess that must be, yeah, thank you. Hello, everybody. I have a long-standing interest in health inequalities and particularly the contribution of early life to social inequalities and health inequalities. And I guess that might be called life history by some, though that's really what we're going to talk about tonight. But I've also got a slightly separate interest in what models from evolutionary biology can do for human social science and how exactly you do that. So it's a slightly kind of meta-scientific interest, which I think I share with several other people on this panel. So those two things kind of come together on this terrain of life history theory we're talking about today.
So it is always valuable for a community, I think, to sort of look back, at history. And before this journal was called Evolution and Human Behavior, it was actually called Ethology and Sociobiology. And about 40 years ago, in that journal, there was a report published on a workshop that was titled Evolutionary Life History Analysis of Human Behavior, 40 years ago. And it's a very wonderful piece, and I actually recommend that people, look it up. It's cited also in some of the papers in the special issue, including in the introduction that Daniel and I wrote. And towards the end, the authors of that report, and that's Weigel and Burton-Jones, they conclude that detailed attention needs to be focused on theoretical developments before empirical endeavors can be said to test whether human life history strategies are evolutionarily adaptive. So they're saying, there needs to be more developed theory for us to really know when we're doing life history research, are we testing, predictions that follow from theory? And this is a theme that's actually present in a number of the papers in the special issue. So, for example, Marco has in his paper a quote where he says, the field needs to update its theoretical assumptions. Rebecca writes that the field seems to have increasingly drifted away from sort of life history research in evolutionary biology, and it suffers from a lack of theoretical formalization, meaning that verbal arguments are often made about what life history theory, quote unquote, predicts, which are not firmly grounded in formal theory. And that's sort of a sentiment that's present in a number of the papers, even in people who kind of have other, maybe diverging opinions on a number of other issues. So I thought it'd be nice to start with that kind of foundational issue that's also, anchored in sort of the history of the field. And maybe, Rebecca, maybe you could explain in a couple of minutes, why you wrote that you think that the field has sort of become a bit untethered from its origins.
Yeah, so in life history theory paradigm and evolutionary biology, formal modeling is a very important part of that paradigm. It always has been, and it still is. When life history theory began to be applied to the human sciences, initially in anthropology, there was some formal modeling that was certainly in there, but there was an awful lot of empirical work, sure, for a whole range of reasons. And then as life history theory became more and more incorporated into psychological work, there was even less formal modeling. I think empirical work, as an empiricist myself, is hugely important, but I think it does need to go hand in hand with formal modeling. Some of the most successful work in evolutionary anthropology in life history theory unites formal modeling with empirical work, like Kim Hill and Magdalena Hurtado's book on actual life history. And I think it's really important because it's the formal modeling that allows you to make predictions. So there are lots of verbal arguments in our discipline, not just in relation to life history traits, but in all other areas too, where we make verbal statements about what theory predicts, but they're not grounded in formal modeling. And I think it is really important that if we're going to use language like theory predicts, we need to ground that much more firmly in formal modeling, which is not something that's being done at the moment. That's not to say that everybody needs to become a formal modeler. Again, I think empirical work is hugely important, and I think it needs to go alongside formal modeling. But I think perhaps the empirical work needs to be a little bit more exploratory than it has been in at least some cases in the past.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Maybe Marco, maybe it would be nice if, because I also quoted you, maybe you can share your thoughts on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Rebecca. I mean, the assessment is kind of obviously the case. So my paper in the special issue was a bit of a, I think I thought of it as a transitional paper in a way. in the sense that I think we really need to start thinking about updating some of the assumptions and some of the methods in the field. However, I would not like for the field to just abandon some ideas and findings without a little more thinking and trying to kind of, save what has to be saved and maybe throw away what needs to be thrown away. But I'm a bit, it's true that there are no strong theoretical models, especially when you move to behavioral traits, let's say behavioral and physiological traits, right, which is what psychologists focus on. They really want to explain the covariation between behaviors and physiology and maybe some maturational events. But there are no strong theoretical models making predictions there. Problem is there aren't strong theoretical models either in biology. I mean, that's even in formal work on life history theory in biology. A lot of the work is focused on, let's say, basic life history traits like reproduction timing or maturation or generic allocations between, let's say, growth versus reproduction. But of course, these things are mediated by behavior and physiology. But how exactly they are mediated by behavior and physiology, in many cases, is not entirely clear. And we don't have a lot of good models that make predictions about the behavioral basis of these traits and these outcomes. So I would say that's definitely a big gap. I mean, there's a huge gap. I think there are enough, and this is my position in the paper, was there enough bits of theory and evidence to, I think, justifying using these ideas as heuristics. We have to be mindful that these, at this point, are no more than heuristics. However, I mean, other fields haven't worked out the whole thing either. So, for example, there's the whole evolutionary biology, pace of life syndrome, and that is also not very formalized, although it's starting to. People are starting to work on little bits of theory, and hopefully they will converge into something that's more coherent.
Yeah, Marco. Yes, I understand what you're saying, and some of the things you're moving sort of into are also topics that I envision. We will cover. In a little while. For instance, like the approaches that cover not only life history traits but also physiology and cognition, for instance. But I think you made a very valid and also important point about. Some of these models basically don't even exist in evolutionary biology. So that means that, the formal foundation is not just lacking in the human work, it's lacking, to some extent, at least for certain types of covariations in evolutionary biology as well. I wanted to now ask maybe Daniel to comment on this question. And also, Daniel, you've done some work looking at sort of citation patterns across different fields and the different approaches. And so you did like a bibliometric analysis. I worked with you on that, and that kind of revealed also some of the changes that seem to be occurring in how these fields develop. Could you comment on your findings?
Yes, I mean, so just to summarize those findings, well, you know this because you were involved in that project with me, that we analyzed citation patterns to papers using the term life history theory over the last 20 or 30 years. And what you find is at the beginning, this is quite a small and unified sort of body of papers. But by the recent years, it's actually fractionated into different clusters of papers that don't really refer much to each other. So most obviously, there's a big cluster in psychology, which is really interested in individual differences and measuring the sort of covariation of various individual difference variables, that describes its findings. And this is no comment on the validity of those findings. I'm just trying to describe what's in the literature. It describes those findings as being life history theory. Whereas when people working on non-human animals employ the term life history theory, they mean something quite different, and they actually are referring to a different body of evidence. Again, that's not with passing judgment on which of these is better. It's just the same term is being used really in two somewhat different senses in the literature, which is very confusing for people who come in and they say, oh, life history theory predicts this because it says it, at the beginning of this paper. I think there's an interesting question here. I really appreciated both what Rebecca and what Marco said, that there are just different uses, different fields or different communities of people have different sense of what constitutes theory. And something I'm aware, because in my work I've rubbed people up the wrong way sometimes, when I've said, theory needs to be based on formal modeling, they say, well, why is that the only, why is that the only way? Aren't there other kinds of work which are equally valuable? And I think there are other kinds of work, more inductive work, more exploratory work, which are equally valuable. We just need to have a different language from that, other than saying life history theory predicts. If in fact we have found regularities in which kind of traits co-vary, we don't need to throw that out. We just need to find a different language for saying, life history theory predicts, as in I've done an a priori model and this is the prediction under a wide range of circumstances, versus empirical experience over many populations has shown that these two things often go together, right? And we need to find a different way of describing that, because it's also valuable, right? It's also valid, and we don't need to throw it out. But it's wrong if we say life history theory predicts that if it's not founded in some formal model of how selection acts on traits. So that's my thought.
Keelah, I wanted to ask your thoughts on this issue.
Yeah, so I think it's also important to recognize that life history theory, as it was initially conceptualized, wasn't actually designed for human behavior. And so a direct application of it might be an oversimplification of some of the really complex human motivational systems. And we should expect that it would be unlikely to get at the kind of nuanced trade-offs that evolved systems and humans have. So maybe our ambition should also be, can we create a better life history theory for human behavior?
I may just follow up on your response. When you're saying, sort of a better life history theory for human behavior, are you thinking about theory that is, explicitly incorporating features, that characterize specifically the human life history, rather than some of the features that are often assumed in these models, let's say, asexual reproduction or, no parent offspring conflict, things that Marco has also, written about as things that are really important to consider and that are not sometimes considered in the models that people sort of use as a basis for their, for their hypotheses, I'll say, which is, so what do you think when you say, we should move in that direction? Could you give some sort of rough outline of what you would like to see, what you think would be progress?
That's a really big question. I think something that a lot of the panelists are probably going to have more insight on here. I think it's useful for us to think about where the points of general consensus are, and where the questions are for future research. Where are the places where we need to have a little bit more of an understanding of either the terminology that we're using when we're talking about strategies, and whether they include cognitive, physiological, behavioral traits, and so forth, the operational definitions of the different ecological features that we're saying shape the behaviors that we're trying to predict, and so forth. I think that there are a lot of areas that still need some clarity, and that some of those areas have to do with what might be unique to humans as compared to non-human animals.
Yeah, I think this is also maybe a nice bridge to the issue that Marco already touched on, which is, one of the things in which the field is sort of developed, and that's not just true in the human literature, but also, for instance, in the pace of life syndrome literature in the study of non-human animals, is that people started looking at sort of broader suites of traits that incorporate not just life history traits, but also things like cognition and physiology. And so we've now talked a little bit about the fact that maybe, there are very interesting ideas there for sure, and there are very interesting empirical studies there for sure. Maybe, the sort of the formal basis is still, sort of small in the sense that there's a lot of room there for development. But if we are starting to think sort of empirically about these correlations, and then specifically in humans, you know, to what extent do people think that, you know, what is the current state of evidence for those kinds of suites of correlated traits? And I kind of asked this question because I've talked about this topic with a number of people, and I get quite different opinions. So I think some people will answer like, well, there's, you know, very little evidence, and then there's other people who say, well, clearly, you know, if we kind of zoom out, we see these patterns across, you know, across humans. So focusing on individual differences, Rebecca, to what extent do you think there is evidence already for covariation of these, you know, life history and cognitive and physiological traits?
My answer would be only limited evidence at the moment, not least because these questions have only been asked in a very limited range of contexts. So in the life history research, in human life history research, it's not the case that we only look at weird societies. The last roundtable was about evolutionary approaches to human behavior going beyond weird societies. In fact, there is a lot of life history literature beyond weird societies, but there is very little that looks at suites of behavioral traits. The life history research beyond weird societies in human research has been about mostly life history trade-offs. That was a lot of the early research. The behavioral research is mainly in weird societies because it is mainly done by psychologists. And I don't think there's a great deal of evidence at the moment that you see very large suites of behavioral or cognitive traits that are correlated with life history outcomes, because the largest body of research in psychology which looks at these correlated suites of behavioral traits hasn't looked at life history outcomes, which I have always found extremely surprising. So I would say at the moment the evidence is very limited.
So I think I saw in the behavior of Marco that you partially agree. Marco, maybe you could elaborate, maybe in a couple of minutes, explain your thoughts on this issue.
Sure. I was thinking, I mean, the evidence is limited or less limited depending a bit on how you look at that. I would say we probably need to do a bit more work of piecing together findings from different areas of research. So for example, there is quite a bit, I mean, not as much as I want, but in psychology, there's quite a bit of research on, say, personality correlates of things like fertility and age of reproduction, mortality too. So there are some predictions, there are some data. One problem that people haven't addressed yet is the problem of stochasticity. When you move to the individual level of trying to predict things like age at reproduction or age at death or number of offspring, things like that, there's a lot of stochasticity. There's a lot of big random component, really big random components. So correlations can't be that large. You really need big samples. You need to. So I think, for example, genetic correlations are going to be especially informative now. And then again, those are not huge, but you see patterns sometimes that are a bit more clear than what you see in behavioral outcomes. I would say my assessment of the evidence is for a number of personality and behavioral traits, I think the correlational pattern is pretty robust. Things like, again, impulsivity, risk, social sexuality, I mean, they do cluster in a way you would, again, expect based on kind of deductive, inductive mix of things. Correlations with things like mating patterns, maybe some components of parental investment. I think there's encouraging evidence. I also think it was a bit probably a mistake to push so strongly on age at menarche and pubertal development in humans, because the more I think about it and read about it, that there's new finding coming out, you see some small correlations, but it's probably not as critical as a developmental event as it is in other animals. So there's not such, in the standard life history model, age at maturity and age at first reproduction is basically the same parameter. Because the assumption is that when you get sexually mature, that's when you start mating and reproducing if you can. In humans, it's strongly decoupled. There's many other, social and individual steps in between that. The correlations, if you want to see them, there's something there. It's very weak. And I'm reanalyzing some data now. And again, it's really hard to find strong and convincing correlations with puberty. I don't think there's nothing there. So I think there is something there. But the idea of a lot of the developmental literature, and I think with some reasons, have centered on maturation because it seemed to be something different from psychological traits, and kind of anchored this in something more biological. I think the focus on puberty has been a bit of a misdirection. Not because it's not important, because it's not as important as people have made it.
I wanted to ask also, Keelah, your thoughts on this, and also the implications of your essay of the of the evidence for the sort of social perception that you study, because in a way it's maybe anchored on some of these correlations between ecology and behavior, and covariance between traits perhaps as well. So maybe you can share your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think that it depends in part on if we're talking about the covariation between life history traits, or we're talking about physiological traits or behaviors or so forth. So it really depends in part on how you're defining the strategies. But in the work that I've done, I've been looking at 5 particular features of a life history strategy. So sexual unrestrictedness, impulsivity, investment in education, which is trying to get at sort of putting energy towards embodied capital, and investment in offspring, and social opportunism, so physical aggressiveness. And what we find is that when you give people information, asking them to imagine an individual who's lived in an environment that's very resource poor and unpredictable, as compared to someone who's lived in an environment that's resource rich and predictable, what do you stereotype that person as being like on these different dimensions? And what we find is that they stereotype them in the way that you would predict from this perspective of people from harsh environments are stereotyped as more sexually unrestricted, so more likely to have children at a young age, for example, more impulsive, less invested in their children, less invested in education, and so forth. And in our work, we measured those sub-constructs independently, so they need not have all clustered together, but in fact they did. So they were highly correlated with one another. And what I would draw from that is that this evidence doesn't necessarily mean that these traits have to cluster together in reality, right? They could, but they don't necessarily need to, because the reality can be complex and complicated, but the stereotypes themselves don't have to be. Our minds can simplify in ways that are insensitive to information that doesn't bear on affordances for us. So we find in our work that these traits do cluster, and they cluster strongly together. I wouldn't necessarily extract from that it's absolutely true in reality also, but we need more research to figure that out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm also curious, Daniel. So I'm curious of your essay of the evidence, and I'm also curious on your thoughts on, how do we disentangle whether, if to the extent that we do see these, these covariances that people at least have sort of thought about as being, adaptive responses, evolved adaptive responses, first of all, I want to ask, to what extent do you think that there's evidence for those covariances? But then in addition, I would like to ask you, how can researchers tease apart the hypothesis that these are kind of evolved responses, versus responses to the current incentive structures of the environment? Or is it important to tease those apart? I think it probably is. Curious on your about evidence, and how can we distinguish as researchers whether we're dealing with evolved adaptive responses versus adaptive responses to current incentives.
Well, I think that's an interesting question, Willem. First of all, on the sort of covariation issue, I also find that depending who you ask, you get very different answer. My my impression is that the idea of a sort of a major axis of covariation of lots of different things is rather weaker than the literature would lead you to suspect, right? I mean, even within the narrow psychometric way in which it's often measured, there's a lot of debate about how much variance any single axis really explains in those psychometric. So even if you accept the limitations of that kind of rather psychometric questionnaire approach, it's not really clear that the covariances are as strong as you think they might be. Also, we'd be mistaking ourselves if we said that filling in a questionnaire tells you about people's behavior, right? Because we've known for 50 years that that's not really true. So there might be reasons that there might be a single axis of how you respond to various questionnaires about your behavior and attitudes, other than that the actual behaviors, co-vary in those ways. And I think, I think Keelah's work's really interesting from this point of view, right? When people fill in questionnaires, even about themselves, they're aware of their implicit and stereotype theories about how things co-vary, right? So you're not looking at their behavior directly, you're looking at how they report themselves. That's very important to remember. We don't know how this relates to what they actually do, and we don't know how that relates to their fitness. So that's a problem if we're using evolutionary kind of approaches. On your other question, Willem, about how do we sort of recognize things that are somewhat accidentally bunged together because of common environmental factors from things that are really mechanistically coupled in some deep way, I think that's really hard. But one way is if the patterns of covariance are really different across different populations, then you need a different kind of explanation than saying there's some pan-human mechanism that means when my age at reproduction goes earlier, a whole load of other things automatically get pulled around. If in fact, in different populations under different demographic and ecological conditions, those covariances end up very different, which I suspect they will, because we know that's even true in animal populations, right? Animal populations in different ecologies have different patterns of trait covariation. Then I think we've got to think a little bit differently about these things, I suppose.
Any of the other speakers interested in following up on this particular response by Daniel? Okay, so I just muted myself. So this question about the current incentives is also partially derived from one of the questions I saw being asked by the audience, and I'm seeing that there's lots of really great comments being made by the audience also in the chat, and lots of literature is being recommended. So there's a very active conversation, and that's really really nice. And I'm attentive to it, and I'm trying to weave some of it into the discussion. But there's a lot going on in a good way. So maybe we can then talk a little bit more about measurement. So we've gone a bit, from kind of theory to these covariance structures of different traits. And now we're kind of moving a bit into the topic of measurement. I'd like to maybe start by acknowledging that the journal Evolutionary Psychology had a nice special issue on, discussions about the psychometric approach to life history in 2017. So if that's, if you want to read about, you can also check out that special issue. It's also a topic that's covered in a number of the papers in the current special issue in EHB, including by Rebecca, for example. Rebecca, you have some pretty critical, I think, comments on, for example, the psychometric approach to life history. You also kind of distinguish between different, sort of different branches of life history theory. You distinguish between 3 different branches. I think it'd be interesting if you could say a bit more about, how do you think people should go about measuring these things? Maybe that's, maybe in sort of it's more important, I think, to focus on, where do we want to go sort of from here going forward, and maybe a little bit less on sort of, what's been done in the past, and, what are the good and bad things about that. So maybe you can sort of look forward and say, I would like people to do this type of work going forward.
I think the first thing to say there is that if people are going to use the language of life history, they should be looking at life history traits. That doesn't exclude looking at behavioral traits at all. I think it's really important to look at both together. As Marco said, behavior as well as physiology is likely to mediate life history trade-offs. So I think research in the human behavioral sciences that unites looking at life history traits and behavioral traits is really important. But I think if you're going to use that language of life history theory, you need to incorporate life history traits in there. And one of my concerns with the psychometric approach is that it doesn't look at life history traits at all. It's entirely behavioral. And I do think that is very problematic. In terms of where we go forward, I do think there could be greater integration across the behavioral outcomes, the psychological outcomes, and the physiological outcomes as well. There are these independent bodies of work that are often producing really nice research, but aren't very necessarily well integrated with one another. So, for example, there's a lot of work on the physiology behind life history trade-offs in reproductive ecology, which is fantastic work, but not necessarily so well integrated with some of the more behavioral work. So I think greater integration with the different branches of work on human life history. I also think there really does need to be clarity in terminology. So I think I think Daniel said this earlier, but there's a huge amount of confusion in the literature at the moment. A lot of people are using the phrase life history theory or life history and meaning something quite different. So I think the terminology that you and Daniel have introduced of life history theory E and life history theory P, meaning life history theory in evolutionary biology and in psychology, is hugely helpful to unpicking some of this confusion. When I wrote the paper for your special issue, part of the reason for writing it was to try and clarify some of this confusion, but the process of writing the paper and having it peer-reviewed really emphasized to me just how deep the confusion is. Because in the first draft of that paper, I used life history theory to refer to life history theory in evolutionary biology, which is what I think life history theory is. But it was clear that some of the reviewers thought I was referring to the paradigm in psychology, particularly the psychometric approach. But that is a qualitatively different approach. And I think using the same terminology for both of those approaches is really problematic. So I think, first of all, we need to sort out our terminological confusion, and then we need to integrate better the different types of life history research in terms of behavior, physiology, and looking at some of the more evolutionary anthropological approaches to fitness outcomes.
Wow, thank you, Rebecca. That was a very informative, rich answer. In your answer, you also actually covered what is sort of the question that many people would like to also have the panelists answer. I can see that, you know, that question that is sort of high up the ranks is, you know, what do you then see as life history theory? Like, just what is your, you know, what is your view of, and I think you clarified that you know, view it the way it's practiced in evolutionary biology, which is, you know, largely, you know, sort of formalized, and then there's at least life history traits, and then sometimes additional, you know, cognition and physiology as well. So while we maybe cover, you know, this topic of where do we want to go, and sort of clarifying our terminology in everybody's answers, maybe you can, you know, just like Rebecca did, sort of clarify what you think, you know, when you're thinking life history theory, what does it mean, the way you use it. Keelah, would you like to go next?
Sure. So just following up on some issues related to measurement, one thing that I think would be an area for growth would be to move away from using single variables as proxies for life history strategies. So I've seen in some research, like using, for example, sociosexuality, right? Or as the dependent variable measuring risk-taking propensity or impulsivity, or, you know, one other thing, but always a single variable. And I think we've seen from the conversation already today that there might be a lot of utility in broadening out what it is that we're measuring. So I would encourage maybe more in that direction. And then I'm a little confused about the question, what do you mean when you say life history theory, and that's so broad? What, can you narrow the question for me? What is it that you think that people are asking here?
Yeah, so so Rebecca described that during her, you know, writing and editing process, you know, some of the reviewers when they, when she said, for instance, life history theory, there are no life history models that, predict A, B, or C, or there are no life history, empirical studies of A, B, and C, maybe the reviewers would be like, well, there is, look, there are these studies, and then, but from Rebecca's perspective, those things are not actually, they are not life history, for instance, measurement instruments, because they don't measure life history traits. And so it looks like, there might be differences in what people have in mind when they are using this term. And so I think one of the audience members suggested that it would be nice if each of the panelists would just clarify what they see, what is there, are they using, are you using a sort of a narrower definition of life history focused on life history traits, or a broader one that includes these other traits? Do you see theory as being sort of formal models, or do you see theory as, just ideas that can also be induced from observations, or, deduced from models, or sort of what is your representation of what this sort of this concept means?
Yeah, so from that I can say that I definitely see life history strategy in particular as including not just the life history traits themselves, but also the cognitive and behavioral traits.
Okay, I now see that the person who asked the question, actually what they meant, and maybe I sort of partially misunderstood the question, the person was really wondering what you think are the key questions in life history theory. And so in that sense, it's kind of building on also what I suggested where we go next in the conversation, which is what would we like the field to do? What are the key questions that people should now invest, their time and energy in? Thank you. So Marco, what do you think? Where should we go? What should we do?
Ooh. Okay, I think let me try to do a couple of things at the same time. So to Doug's question about what are the key questions, I mean, there are many questions. I mean, life history theory, to some extent, you could say it's almost everything in the evolution of individual organisms. So when you put growth and reproduction at the same time, you have population growth. So life history theory, in a way, is just a way to explain what natural selection is about. So it's not very distinct from general. So for some people, it's just a general way of making explicit what's implicit in the idea of natural selection and Darwinian models. So there's a lot of stuff in there. I think one of the key contributions of life history theory is the thinking in terms of trade-offs. That's the main thing, I guess. And then you have to think about trade-offs between life history outcomes, but you can also think about trade-offs in behavioral allocations and things that might feed into those, and so on and so forth. And I think just the trade-off concept is maybe what links or should link all the different applications of this framework. And then, of course, I mean, I would love to see more formal modeling. So I don't, I would definitely love that. In terms of measurement, because you raised this issue, I would probably say three things, four maybe. The first is in terms of I know, sorry. It's terminology. I think one thing that's really people should stop doing, say, oh, we measured life history strategies with this questionnaire. That's really giving the wrong impression and creating a lot of confusion. Questionnaires can be fine. My advice would be try to know what you're measuring. Try to know what you're measuring, what the questions are actually about. Because some of the, you could go with trying to measure more narrower traits, and that's the approach I'm kind of trying to to explore. Go back to kind of narrower traits that have the most validation in terms of predicting behavioral outcomes that are plausibly related to fitness components like reproduction and mortality and stuff like that. And for some traits, again, there is some evidence, like impulsivity. Probably the one, if I had to choose one broad trait, that would be it. But if you use questionnaires, you should know what you're measuring. Some questionnaires that are kind of life history inspired, for example, they have a strong component of neuroticism, emotional instability. So if you're using that questionnaire, for example, I've seen people trying to predict anxiety and depression using a life history questionnaire that has a big component of neuroticism. So of course you're going to find correlations, but what is it that you're measuring, right? Mm-hmm. So just this reification of some of the questions is something that worries me a bit. And again, the solutions should be, from my point of view, just know what you're doing, know what you're measuring each time. Yes.
So one of the things that Marco stressed, I think, as sort of an anchor, for the field is trade-offs, and that's also something that's very salient in Rebecca's paper. And there's actually another paper that I haven't mentioned yet by Elizabeth Boland, and it's all about measuring trade-offs and how to do it, like concrete suggestions about how to measure trade-offs. Work from evolutionary biology that has tried to measure trade-offs, but also how difficult it really is to establish trade-offs. But it sounds like at least half of the panelists, and I think maybe the other panelists would agree too, but Daniel, you can share your thoughts next. I think evolutionary anthropology started out focused, measuring these trade-offs, and some of them still do, but in much of of the more recent work, that's become less of a priority, I think. And maybe part of what the panelists are saying is that it should, be prioritized more than it has in some of the work. Daniel, could you comment on, what you think are the key issues going forward, the key questions?
Yeah, just to sort of chip in on what should we call life history theory. Obviously, any claim to use a term in a particular way is a colonial claim, and so I'm sort of nervous of that. That obviously that it's a political act. But I personally favour keeping the term life history theory to refer to what it referred to when it was first coined, which is the formal modelling of how natural selection acts on the allocation of energy to reproduction, maintenance, and growth over the lifespan in different environments, right? I mean, we could just say that would be life history theory. Not that the other stuff is not important, but let's call it by a different thing. I think so that's one group of stuff that we still really need to do, right? The problems are not solved in that arena. I think that the evolutionary psychology work for me is of two flavors, which I think we should give two different names. So a lot of it is just what I would call life course epidemiology. How does stuff that happens to you early in life, affect, for example, when you're a child, affect outcomes that you have many years later? Now, there's a name for that. It's called life course epidemiology. It's a huge field, and it's a very good one, but it's not the same as life history theory. So I would say that we could call some of the developmental stuff, we could call that life course epidemiology, possibly psychological life course epidemiology. And then there's another thing, which I think the more psychometric work is getting at, which is something to do with behavioral strategies, right? So someone who has more of this, do they do less of something else, right? And that it kind of has something of the flavor of life history theory in that the notion of the trade-off is very salient to it. If you're doing more of this, you have to be doing less of something else. So it's got, in an informal sense, it's got something of life history theory about it, but it's not really about modeling natural selection directly. And so I think we should just have another name for that. And it's super interesting, right? And it might be to do with the environment, and also to do with, once you start doing more of X, you have to do a bit less of Y, and that's super interesting and extremely valid and can proceed inductively and needs to have its own theoretical models. But I personally wouldn't call it life history theory because it just gets confusing, right? From my perspective. But as I say, that's just, I'm sure others will disagree because that is a very particular view of the literature.
So one of the desires, of the audience is that we make the discussion more concrete. So we've thought about things, largely also in a theoretical way. So let's make things maybe more concrete. So a concrete question that I think that hasn't really come up that much yet, although a little bit, is, many studies of human life history do not measure, adaptive outcomes like survival or reproductive success or number of healthy offspring or, whatever, proxy we're trying to use. So concretely, if I'm a life history researcher and I have a wonderful, amount of resources and I can do a good study on this, is it still possible and valid to measure these types of metrics in some human societies, in all human societies, in no human societies, because there's evolutionary disequilibrium in many places, or should we measure adaptive outcomes, and concretely how should we do this? Keelah, what are your thoughts on this?
So this isn't exactly my area of expertise or research. With people in the audience asking for examples and to be more concrete. So I just want to be more specific about the kind of work that I'm doing and how it comes about and how I see it as being linked to life history theory, right? And it goes back to what Marco was talking about as the idea of trade-offs being very fundamental and thinking about the different tasks to which we can devote time and energy and effort and so forth. And so I think that that's a really, really useful and generative kind of concept that you can then derive from predictions about human behavior and predictions about how you would expect human behavior to be affected by ecological features. And so that was the point that we were starting with. It was looking at what out there in the existing literature is there about how particular features of the environment then shape the behavior of the organisms that live in those environments, and humans specifically. So when there are environments that are higher in extrinsic mortality, for example, what effect does that have on the behavior of the organisms that live there? And then with those existing findings in mind, we then tried to create items that would capture those kinds of trade-offs or those kinds of ways of allocating effort. So for example, the idea of whether someone is likely to have children at a young age or to engage in criminal behavior, right? And then we would tell people, imagine someone who lives in a place where money and jobs are scarce and unpredictable. And so that was how we were operationally defining harshness. And in other research that we've done, we have given information about environments related to mortality, like that there's a lot of random violence that occurs in those places or not. And then asking, think of a person who lives in an environment like that, and then how likely are they to have children at a young age, have sex at a young age, engage in criminal behavior, be impulsive, make plans in advance, and so forth. So concretely, I hope that's giving people an idea of how at least I have gone about in the research that I've done, looking at life history strategy, looking at these behaviors that are associated with the trade-offs that people make towards mating, parenting effort, and so forth.
Yeah, I think that is very valuable, and I think maybe the other speakers could do a similar thing. I think those concepts of environmental stress or harshness or unpredictability, the way that people conceptualize these terms and the way that they operationalize them in research, that what they actually end up measuring, that's there's partial overlap between different studies, and so I'm quite interested. Maybe I should also then briefly say, while we're on this topic, that there is also a paper by Ethan Young and Bruce Ellis and myself on the concept of environmental unpredictability and the different ways in which that construct is used in different areas of life history research in humans, but also in non-human research. So if you're interested in environmental unpredictability, that paper fleshes that out in quite a bit of detail. Maybe one of the other panelists could comment a bit on the concepts, harshness, unpredictability, and measuring adaptive outcomes in contemporary societies of various kinds.
I would like to say I would hugely support the idea of studying adaptive outcomes, because that would allow us to get back to life history traits. So studying fertility mortality in particular, I think, is so important for this area of research, because that's what life history theory is all about, in my view. So Daniel, I would absolutely love it if the term life history theory could be restricted to research that is on life history traits of fertility, mortality, and growth. Unfortunately, I fear that ship has sailed. I think there is now such a juggernaut of research in evolutionary psychology that isn't going to happen. So we need new terminology that will clear some of the confusion in the literature. But I would love it if we would only refer to life history traits within the context of life history theory. I think that studying those adaptive outcomes of fertility and mortality is hugely important, and it's not done nearly enough in the evolutionary social sciences, because this is what evolution is about. And I think even if people don't want to spend their entire careers looking at fertility, mortality, these kinds of outcomes, they need to understand them if they're to be evolutionary scholars. So I really think evolutionary social scientists should learn some demography before they go back to studying evolutionary social science. I do think studying adaptive outcomes is difficult, though, because our environments have changed so much recently in many cases. So we do need to be very aware that we're not studying adaptive outcomes that have remained constant in human history for millennia. That's not the case at all. So I think we need to very carefully look at how these factors vary by environmental context. So I think doing this cross-culturally in many different contexts is hugely important. The final point I'll make here is that studying trade-offs in terms of adaptive outcomes is actually quite tricky. I did this quite a bit in the start of my career, looking at, for example, whether there's empirical evidence that women who invest a lot in reproduction suffer subsequently in terms of higher mortality rates or lower fertility rates. And in fact, it's very hard to demonstrate that empirically, at least using relatively straightforward statistical analyses, because of this problem of phenotypic correlations. It's women who are in a very good health who can afford to have lots of children. So instead of seeing that heavy investment in reproduction is correlated with poorer subsequent outcomes, it looks like heavy investment in reproduction is correlated with better subsequent outcomes because of this big house, big car problem. So we also need to think about how we can develop statistical methods for really thoroughly analysing fertility and mortality and trying to understand these life history trade-offs in a range of different contexts.
Daniel, would you, or Marco, sorry, I think Marco was maybe first. Maybe Marco, you can go first, and then after that, Daniel.
Yeah, just building on what Rebecca said, I think the other thing I think inevitably we have to try to reconstruct some of the links by, again, piecing different pieces of research together. For example, you do have, in, say, hunter-gatherer societies, quite a bit, not as much as we would want, but quite a bit of research on behavioral correlates of some reproductive and mortality outcomes. So, for example, when you look at things like parental investment or whatever, pair bonding, stability, social dominance, and things like that, it's not like we don't have any ideas about some behavioral outcomes correlate with. And so even if if it's hard to study them in, for example, say, industrialized societies with lots of things changed and a weird ecology, you can still try to reconstruct the links. What I would encourage people to do is to be very explicit about the links and the chain of inference, instead of just assuming that we know exactly how things correlate with other things. But I think there's more evidence out there that could be pieced together, and to some extent we can't do anything else, because in some population, there's decoupling between some traits and outcomes and behaviors. It's really hard to reconstruct what's going on. Even if you can do interesting things from a statistical point of view. I also think, again, there was just a new paper by Rebecca Lawn and others using Mendelian randomization. So there are some interesting genetic methods that allow you to tease apart some of the causality in there, and they looked at some life history traits in females. So but you have to get in the mindset, I think, that you have to go out of your discipline and try to find the evidence where the evidence is, and really do a careful work of stitching it together in a way that makes sense, and then hope it works. Yeah. Oh, I will say, can I say one thing about stress? That was a big, I haven't checked the chat for a while, but it was a big topic at some point. So stress, a couple of years ago, it was funny, I was invited on a panel in a biology conference about how do we define stress. And the answer was, unsurprisingly, no, we have no idea. So the concept of stress is a kind of a big, giant conceptual mess, not just in psychology, but elsewhere. At the same time, there are some things there that are really important. So the idea, for example, that stress, and I have a paper, maybe someone can pick it up, I have a paper 2018 on what is stress from a biological perspective, and there everyone in some ways agrees that predictability and controllability are the main things that stress response systems, and when you say that organisms or cells or plants or they get stressed, there's usually some connection with the failure to predict and control the environment, some key fitness-related variables. If that's the case, I think there is a strong reason to keep using stress as a concept that relates to fundamental dimensions of the environment. However, again, you want to be more precise about what.
So now I wanna give the mic to Daniel. Daniel, maybe you can comment on your your work and your measures of harshness and unpredictability, and how you think it should be related to adaptive outcomes, if at all, in contemporary society.
Yes, well, that's there's a few different things there. I'm not actually a great fan of notions like harshness and unpredictability. I think they're too general. And I think that oddly we plug in the idea that there might be harshness is just a sort of feature of the environment, or unpredictability is oddly domain general for evolutionary psychology, right? Because it seems to me that, I do work on food insecurity, which is particularly unpredictability in the domain of food. And that, it turns out, does a lot of things to you. It does things to you metabolically. It does things to do in terms of your body weight. But I wouldn't say that that's unpredictability in general, right? It's really domain specific. And unpredictability in interpersonal relationships might be a completely different thing, which is uncorrelated with that. So I think these assumptions that environments can be simply characterized by like one latent variable, like it's more stressful or it's less stressful, are a bit meaningless. And actually, as Marco says, the concept of stress, no one has any idea what that means, really. I mean, physiologists define it quite differently from ecologists, for example. So I just think we should avoid these things. And I think it's odd that we're quite so domain general. I think we should really focus on, think about the organism, think about what it's trying to do and how its psychology works, and what are the kinds of things it might be attending to. So if it's to do with eating and metabolism, it might be the supply of food that you attend to. It's not some more general parameter. So I think that's my first point. And I think that we've been a bit too lazy about saying, oh, well, harshness could be SES, or it could be some other thing, or it could be, frankly, whatever I want it to be in this particular study. I think we need to be a bit more disciplined about that. I think the other thing on measuring fitness-related outcomes, I think it entirely depends what your question is. And I completely agree with Marco here that people who've got actually different questions kind of lump them all together. If you want to study how is something under selection in a particular environment, then you need to measure fitness. There's no getting around that. You can't avoid that. And so if you're studying the evolution of something, you need to measure fitness. But if, on the other hand, you just want to study what are the consequences within your life of doing some behavior, you don't need to measure fitness. You need to measure that behavior and the consequences that might be relevant. So, or if you want to measure how some psychological traits co-vary, you don't need to measure fitness to do that. So I just think it's about being really clear actually what your goal is. And I just wonder if different people use the term saying, oh, I'm doing life history theory, actually that aligns some really quite different goals, possibly.
Yeah. And I think the point about, environmental stress or even harshness and unpredictability being sort of too general as a construct, and really needing to think about specific dimensions of stress posing specific challenges for organisms to which they might, evolve and or develop particular responses. I personally think that is also, this is also something that was pointed out, by the way, by Pat Barclay in the chat, that's very important. And I think, and there are, of course, already, people doing that. So it's not that this is a wholly novel idea, but it's not something that's typically done. And maybe, when we do our work on the IV sides, measuring the environment, we should very, think quite deeply about which dimensions of stress, we ought to measure in relation to the traits, and ideally maybe, have a very explicit model, whether it's formal or not formal, but a very explicit model that links those IVs to particular responses by the organism. I can see that Courtney is joining us. Welcome, Courtney.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. Unfortunately, our time is up. We just want to say before we go that Thank you to our moderator and our speakers for this wonderful discussion, the Executive Council of HBUS for the support, and everyone for being here. I know that we had a lot of questions that did not get answered, and I wish we had more time. I do also want to just give a brief plug for the next event, which will be on the origins of political orientation and partisanship, and will take place in mid-December. We're going to send out an announcement for that event soon, so stay tuned. And then finally, we do welcome feedback from HBUS members to improve the event, so feel free to email us at that email that we posted in the chat. And thank you all again for being here.